Okay. It says that we're recording now. Good.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, sadhu, sadhu, sadhu to you.
Yeah. Well, sadhu, sadhu, sadhu to you too then.
Well,
So,
I'm not a monk, or I wasn't a monk, so
well, I'm not one anymore. Anyways, hello and welcome to the show that doesn't have a name. I'm your host, Panyo Basa, and this is my special honored guest, Stevens. And we are going to discuss the occult because Stevens here is somewhat of an occultist, somewhat at least of an occultist. And although I've never really identified as an occultist, my father certainly was. He was, among other things, a warlock. I assume most warlocks are amateurs. You don't get like salary, you don't get paid for being a warlock, I guess. So I assume
well, the
witches,
internet has made your career prospects a lot better as a warlock, believe it
yeah,
or not. But most warlocks are certainly, dabblers and dilettantes and people who read a lot of pulp fiction or occult books and things like that for the most part. But
yeah.
there are some people I think that are quite serious about it, but it generally involves a lifestyle that is not all that different from being a monk, actually.
Yeah, you'd have to be like a sorcerer's apprentice for a while or something and get into the really advanced stuff, I would assume.
Yeah, I don't know how you apprentice to somebody since there aren't any sorcerers. That's kind of the whole problem. But
Oh, they're out there. There are sorcerers out there.
probably not any legitimate ones, or very few legitimate ones anyway.
Well, I'm sure there's some sincere ones, even if they're not able to do much more than card tricks. But
Oh
there,
yeah, there's a lot
like
of
in
sincere.
Burma, for example, I mean, there's alchemists and sorcerers and necromancers and all that sort of thing. In a country that has sort of a pre-modern worldview where people believe in that sort of stuff, it makes it more common, I think. It's almost,
Yeah.
I don't know if you call it mainstream or not, but a belief in that sort of thing is definitely mainstream in certain pre-modern cultures like Burma, where I live.
Hmm.
But I guess we can introduce ourselves, or at least with regard to the occult, we can introduce our respective occultism. And for me, it's like I was already suggesting, is most of what I learned about the occult originally was from my father because he was an occultist. For example, one time he just very seriously warned my brother and me, if you see a knife with a black handle lying around, don't touch it because he misplaced it somehow, and that was the black handle was the black magic knife he used. There was a white handled knife and a black handled knife. And so so I suppose I should just give my father's story to some degree. And as a kid, there was a servant woman who worked in the house who could see ghosts and that sort of thing. There was three Yankee soldiers, especially. My father lived in the deep South. Three Yankee soldiers that she could see, including one that didn't have a head. He apparently took a cannonball or something. But his I think most people have that kind of at least some kind of contact with the paranormal. These weird experiences happen, or there's somebody that that sees ghosts or whatever. But I think his actual introduction to the paranormal happened through in two ways. One, he was a combat medic in World War II, and he realized that through a person who is in shock is in a similar state to a person in a hypnotic trance. And you can tell them that they won't feel pain and that they can restrict blood flow to their arm and this kind of a thing, and it works. And a lot of the other soldiers were calling him the voodoo medic because he was doing this kind of stuff. But I guess hypnosis isn't really considered paranormal. It may have been considered that way, originally, but nowadays it's,
Yeah.
Stanford University has the hypnosis lab and all that. So
In a, they call it what, a hypnagogic state or a hypnopompic state, something like that, and the idea in theory is that if you can bypass your rational consciousness, then you could become, in liminal or in this a-relational state where you are tapping into the singularity or God consciousness or something like that. If you have a certain talent, or if you can exert enough energy on that from that non-egoic state, right? Or at least that's the theory, that you can kind of tweak things a little bit,
Yeah,
right?
that
You
would be
can
like
make
a
things
paranormal.
appear.
That would be like a
You can,
paranormal explanation, although I assume the PhDs at the Stanford Hypnosis Lab would have some different explanation,
yeah,
more
certainly.
scientific explanation, I suppose. So then, my father's real introduction to the occult was through his third wife, not my mother, who it turned out was like just an absolutely excellent hypnotic subject. So my father was already an amateur hypnotist. He was studying that back when he was in the army. Just that's how he knew that, like an injured soldier in a state of shock is in a very similar state to a hypnotic trance, because he was studying hypnosis in the old army medical books. Because there was some kind of research into it back then. So it turned out that he had a wife who would go into such deep hypnotic trances that her heartbeat would almost completely stop. There'd be no discernible breath. And according to my father, she could do automatic writing when she was in a state of trance in several languages that she didn't know in her ordinary state of consciousness, and that she was had such psychic talent or whatever that while she was in a trance, she could open and close doors without touching them, that kind of a thing. And it was through her that he started experimenting with like seances, channeling. I think there's even a newer term for it now than channeling. It's like downloading or something like that. And he met his spirit guide, supposedly, who was a dead Vietnamese monk named Tay Sing or Tai Sing. I can't remember. My father pronounced it Tay Sing. And so, I mean, when I was a kid, instead of watching TV, because we lived out in the country, you only got two crappy channels, if the weather was good, I'd be sitting in my father's lap. He'd be telling stories about astral traveling and like experiments with witchcraft and this kind of a thing. So I got a lot of experience with that as a kid. And then as I got older, especially after I became a monk and went to Burma, like I say, it's just mainstream, a belief in like witchcraft and magic and that sort of thing. There's a saying in Burma that every seventh house, there's houses a witch. People are really afraid of witches. A lot of people have like protection tattoos on their bodies to protect them from witches, among other things. And also, I think my last major advancement in my knowledge of the occult was through reading a book that a friend of mine sent me called The Trickster and the Paranormal by George P. Hansen, which has a really elegant like hypothetical or theoretical explanation for paranormal events, which we can get to later. But I think
I
that's,
just started reading it myself, actually.
yeah, it's well worth reading. It's one of those important books that kind of fills in gaps and can significantly change your understanding of things. That I've read at least half a dozen in my life. I think that's the most recent one that I've read.
If you look at the skeptical Wikipedia article about George Hansen, they just absolutely pan him as being, the craziest kook and all of this stuff. So I thought that was pretty funny. He
Well,
seems like he has a fairly reputable background to me, and the book seems quite scholarly. But
yeah, it's well written, and he's obviously very intelligent and rational. He
if
just
you don't
has a
follow the
psychotic
paradigm, you
inclination.
get panned.
Yeah, well, obviously, like anyone who's going to be championing the paranormal, like parapsychologists or whatever, like skeptical, the skeptics who aren't skeptics at all, because a
Yes.
skeptic in the classical sense suspends judgment. He's an agnostic, whereas these so-called skeptics, like the amazing Randy or whatever, James Randy or whatever, psychop, those people, they just firmly disbelieve in anything other than the laws of scientism. And so they're going to pan or just ridicule or ignore anyone who believes otherwise, seems to me. But let's, yeah, please continue with your introduction. Just explain, how you became familiar with the occult and any practices that you are free to divulge.
Sure, sure. Well, I guess I could say the first fascination that I ever had with the occult was just simply, the old Universal monster movies as a child when I was probably 5 years old. And I think part of my fascination with the monstrous was always that I had really terrible nightmares as a child, basically, starting from the time that I was, I don't know, 4 or whenever I can remember, as far back. And I would have these apparitions in my room at night, when I was falling asleep, and I would see people in the room with me and experience, these like vampires or Frankenstein or these other things that I had been reading about, kind of in my room. Actually, and even before I started reading about them, I was having these kind of dreams which were just awful. And of course, it pissed my parents off because they would have to get up and run in there all the time because I would be, shouting, yelling, thrashing, and stuff like that. And I started even as a child, again, before I really knew what was going on, I was probably 7 years old, having these kind of like, I guess what you would have to call like alien abduction experiences at night as well, right? And these were things which are obviously not physical, because these gray aliens are not descending out into my front yard and pulling all the bricks out of the wall and getting around my parents' room and secreting me out into this craft and then putting me back in again at night and reassembling all the bricks. That explanation always seemed um, very overly simplistic or reductionist to me, right? Which is where I would differ with Brian in my views of it. But I'm not saying it doesn't necessarily. Those things are not real, just not in an empirical sense, right? But those things started to get worse and worse for me over time as I got older instead of better and better. And well, at a certain point, um, I also had different kinds of encounters, with these different creatures. But I started also pouring substances in once I hit high school. And I don't know if that made it better or worse, but I was taking like dissociative drugs and things like that, and getting more and more into different types of meditation and studying these occult books. Um, Again, I don't know why. I just became fascinated with horror, and I think I was a very sensitive child, also, right? I was very affected by um, things that might be, the existence of things that were potentially traumatizing, right? And so I think some of it was maybe like a defense mechanism, like threat rehearsal, they call it, right? Where you're kind of like trying to inoculate yourself to the fear. I remember also being afraid of the dark as a child as well. So I think there was some element of that, but it just sort of turned into a fascination instead. And towards my late teens, I also became interested in shamanism because I was getting into a little bit more of the intellectual side of things like Terence McKenna or, Robert Anton Wilson and Ram Dass and all of those things. Um, and I began experimenting also with LSD and pretty much anything I could get my hands on, really, and combining it with these different practices that I began to discover were out there, which I found really fascinating because I was like, wow, this is like these horror movies, except people actually take it seriously or believe that it's real in some sense. And I think I was also fascinated with the idea that one could develop some sort of power from it, you know, even though this seemed completely like an irrational belief, and I never really took it fully seriously. Um, but nonetheless, I started studying ceremonial magic and Freemasonry and, stuff of the Western tradition. Um, I had always had an interest in Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism. I think it was Little Buddha with Keanu Reeves when I was like 8 years old or something. And so I became interested in that from there. And Japanese Buddhism as well. I read the Hagakure and some of these other sort of Zen texts that were also martial in nature. So at the same time, I was becoming kind of fascinated with martial culture. I guess these are all kind of, dorky things for a kid to, to be intellectually interested in. Maybe getting picked on or something, and so you form these ideas in your head about, um, you know, being able to cast a spell on your enemies or something, maybe.
Yeah, I
But
think kids. Yeah, I used to think about that kind of stuff too.
yeah, so there's that aspect to it, and I think also there's another aspect of the fact that we live in this really hyper secular, ultra rationalistic culture, and we don't have any kind of formative myth, right? I mean, I was taken to Episcopal church a few times, right? I mean, that was the extent of my organized religion experience as a child. And but my dad certainly read to me, myths, read to me things like Lord of the Rings. He was always fascinated with Norse myth and Slavic myth and things of that nature, and Wagner, and maybe some of that stuff was picked up by me, or maybe it's just something genetic. I'm not sure. But the idea that there is some sort of formative myth there that has just been forgotten, perhaps, or that it just needs to be investigated a little bit further because most of it was wiped out by Catholicism or whatever time, who knows. Um, but we're constantly told that, white people have no tradition, or that there is nothing for us, mythically speaking, there. And that's really not true. But the problem is that so much of it is just recreation, right? Like neo-paganism and neo-shamanism and these sorts of things, which are, to my mind, products of, Western consumerism. And
At best, they're like a replica.
yeah, and so, some of the academics say, well, you can never get it back again, and even if you do discover some of this stuff, you're still seeing it through this lens of your culture. But I think, maybe it is possible, if you know enough or you learn enough, to put yourself into the mind of another culture, or of a culture that came a long time ago. It's not going to be perfect, but it's better than nothing, and gives you some sort of meaning and some sort of purpose in life. And I just always felt the airy fairy kind of stuff just never sat well with me, and neither did the Christian thing. I mean, I get it, I understand it, but
Rene Guénon was saying that once a tradition is broken, that I mean you just can't revive it. But I really don't see it. I mean, everybody's got access to, like ultimate reality. I mean, it pervades
exactly,
everybody. And so I
exactly,
mean, there's different levels, so before you get to the ultimate, there's still these other levels that you have access to.
yeah,
So I mean, it would be hit or miss, I think, depending on the individual and what kind of talent or also what kind of knowledge he has. But yeah, I think to expect that something like Norse paganism or classical paganism could be revived by modern or postmodern Westerners is naive. I mean, there's going to be some
yeah,
people maybe in past lives they were really firmly rooted. They were a priest or something that studied the arcane knowledge, and then they just sort of brought it with them into this life or something. But I think for the most part, it's going to be people LARPing or just trying to understand what a pre-modern person would understand, but we don't have a pre-modern mind. It's like
yes,
we've brought Led Zeppelin and Gilligan's Island and Star Trek and all this stuff. We just take it wherever we go. We can live alone in a cave in a forest, surrounded by pre-modern people with pre-modern spiritual ideas, but we still got Star Trek and Gilligan's Island and Led Zeppelin and all that, with us. Our whole upbringing, our whole character was formed in just an alien culture to that. And
yeah,
so it's not going to
yeah.
work.
One of my professors from the University of Florida, who's a famous, at least in his field, of shamanism. He says, once you're in this settler society that has a break from the land, he says it's the land and the tribal connection to it, to this cosmology of sacred sites around the land in this living landscape that connects and binds the tribe to this myth. And he says, once that connection is broken, That's why it's so devastating for some of these indigenous tribes to be uprooted. Once that happens, they become narcissists, they become nihilists, they become fixated on consumption, because that's sort of the only, as I always say, it's the most immediate and apparent aspect of reality that we can get to, is just pleasure and pain. When there's no more myth, when there's no more um, consensus reality for anything that we agree on. The only thing that we can really agree on is, more, is consume, is pleasure, pain, the most sort of
Yeah,
primal
or
aspects.
like the Australian Aborigines who wind up in a city like Melbourne or something. They just live in ghettos and sniff glue or
Yeah,
gas, you
they
know.
they immediately drink themselves to death, or even use, like you said, even worse stuff, and it's terrible, it's pathetic, but that's what the society can do to people. And so my idea, as I think a lot of other teenagers have this idea as well, maybe it's unconscious, it's in there somewhere, this intuition that one has been lied to, and that if one can sort of either empty the mind out or just completely shatter the personality, that maybe something is going to come through, right? And this is, I think, the Aleister Crowley approach, right? Or maybe even the Gurdjieff approach. If one can just sort of undermine all of one's imprinting and conditioning, and basically just shatter your mind, that um, one will realize some sort of ultimate reality, or one will gain access to this non-referential state. And what that means, of course, is becoming schizophrenic, right? Is inducing schizophrenia in yourself in some sense, unless one is able to actually integrate that shadow side, or that right brain, or that a referentiality or whatever, and to reassemble it back into a holistic, integrated personality. One will just be insane,
Yeah,
and
it's like,
most people can't do that.
yeah, we were talking about books that were really important books that can change your paradigm for understanding reality. And like I said, one of them was The Trickster and the Paranormal. But another one that I read before that when I was living in Burma is one called Battle for the Mind. And it's very similar to what you've just been talking about. He starts with like Pavlov's dogs, and how it was just sort of a sideline that he was working on briefly, is making him slobber when he rang a bell, that sort of thing. But his life's work was essentially psychologically and physically torturing dogs until they would break down and they'd just be just neurotic, just shivering and pissing on themselves in the corner of the cage, just cowering, and then he tried to cure them. And he found out that the only way to, I mean, you can teach an old dog new tricks, but unteaching it its old tricks is very difficult, because it's just kind of, we're creatures of habit, dogs and humans. And so what you have to do is you have to somehow bring about a state of just crisis where your habitual way of dealing with reality just isn't working anymore. And then it causes like a breakdown, and then you become very open to suggestion. And this is how Chinese brainwashing works. It's how military basic training works to some degree. It's how some kind of like manhood rituals worked in pre-modern societies. It's how a lot of like born again Christians are born again. They hit this crisis where they just can't, their habitual way of dealing with reality just doesn't work anymore. And then they just kind of break down. They're almost like an empty, like a blank tablet. And then if you've got a person there who's skillful, they can sort of reprogram you for better or for worse. It might be the commissar, at the thought reform camp, who's teaching you to be a good communist or whatever, or it could be, the drill instructor, or it could be like a spiritual person who's, sort of guiding you and giving you a better way of looking at things. But it's just, when you were talking about that, it just reminded me of this, and it does seem to be a valid theory. I think there is definitely some truth to it. Even shock therapy is that sort of thing. It's like an electrical or a chemical initiation of this crisis that just causes all these established habits to just kind of break down, and so that
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
something better can be implanted there.
Well, you use the word initiation, and I think that that's definitely a part of it, right? You have the healing crisis also in the early life of the shaman, generally, or there's some sort of illness. It might not even be a physical one, it might be a spiritual illness. There's something which is calling a person where they can no longer continue with the way of life that they've been leading, and they either heal themselves or die, right? And then at that point, the community names them a shaman. Is one of the reasons why I'm not big into the neo-shamanism thing, right? A shaman is somebody that the community names as a shaman for the purposes of healing and things like
Oh,
that.
really? Yeah,
But
my father knew an Eskimo shaman in Alaska. He lived in Alaska for a long time. Frank Walunga was his name. And apparently, according to Frank Walunga, it's just some children, boys in particular, are just drawn to that sort of thing. They'll sort of like be spying on the shaman and seeing what he's doing and kind of following him around. And the shaman can kind of pick which one has got talent, you know? And he said that his initiation into becoming a full-fledged shaman is you just get sent alone out into the wilderness, and then you find a big flat rock, and then you find like a nice smooth round cobble, and you sit down and you just start rubbing the smooth round rock on the surface of the flat rock in a circle, and you don't eat, you don't sleep, you don't drink water, you just sit there and rub the rock in a circle on the other rock until something happens.
yeah, yeah, well, this is the idea of the vision quest. Some tribes will also do submersion in water at night or something like a cold running river. Usually it's days and days of fasting though, out
Mhm.
away from the structure of society.
And a lot of the time
And
you get the bejesus scared out of you.
yeah, yeah, well, I could see why, right? I mean, you're out there starving in the cold 3 or 4 days or more. Sometimes they're doing long hikes, and at the end, on this empty stomach, having not eaten anything, they might take peyote or something like that, and that's going to hit you really hard when you're sitting out there in the desert, starving, alone. And plus, you have an entirely different belief system, an entirely different cosmology. Um, Let me see, what else was I going to say about that? The I don't know. Go ahead. Sorry, I lost
Uh,
my train of thought.
Well, there's one thing I'd like to ask you about before we get real far with this. Is you said that when you were young, that you were essentially experiencing something like alien abductions or alien encounters.
Yes,
I'm
yes,
just curious. I'm just curious about that.
sure, sure. Well, it goes far. It goes real far. It gets worse and worse as my story goes along. Right. Um, this stuff became more and more intense. I mean, like I said, from my point of view as a Western person, this is a sleep paralysis thing, right? It's just that if it gets real enough, it starts to make you question whether or not there's something more going on, you know. And these events started happening with greater and greater frequency. And particularly once I started delving into the occult stuff and actually doing various rituals, mostly just the basics. But the idea of actually doing this stuff is that you delve into meditation, you get into repeating these things on a daily basis, on a daily schedule. And these things are not necessarily based on having, a bunch of items and doing all of these things that involve wearing certain clothes and all that. Those things are accoutrements, right? The most important thing is the person that's doing it and the way that they're able to discipline their mind and to develop their visualization and to eventually communicate with entities or to invoke them inside of themselves or outside of themselves to basically, I guess, what you would say, hallucinate or cause yourself to hallucinate these types of whatever they are by getting into this a-relational state, whether it's a right brain state that uses creative visualization, but it gets to the point where it gets out of hand. Jung had this type of thing if you read his biography, right, where eventually it gets so intense for him that he's no longer able to keep his mind together. But in my case, it was mostly, sleep related. And I began doing stuff, experimenting with my sleeping practices, trying to wake myself up at certain intervals, or to try to stay awake and pass into sleep completely conscious, doing like yoga nidra or these types of things, basically with the intention of projecting myself outside of my body once I came into a hypnagogic state. And, the first, if you want to call them sleep paralysis, I guess, dreams that I had involved gray aliens, right? Involved these creatures that were very small, shadowy, beings with large heads and things like that, disassembling the side of my wall and pulling me out into this craft. And then I would wake up. I remember I woke up one time in a sitting position in my bed. Um, and these incidences would be accompanied by an incredibly powerful vibration. And the vibration would get stronger and stronger as I would be lying there. I would have, at least ostensibly, it seemed to me as though I was fully awake at the time. I remember, for example, looking up at my ceiling fan. And it's interesting because that fan movement can be associated with what they call visual driving, right? Which is actually a method of shamanism that's used by many tribes, or by the Buryat and people like that, where they have this curtain that comes down over the eyes over and over again. So maybe I was induced into a trance through that, but I was completely awake and the vibration started. You're not able to move, and you feel this sense of paralysis. The vibration gets stronger and stronger, together with this feeling of presence in the room that starts getting extremely strong, to the point that it's terrifying. And at a certain point, as this thing gets closer to you, it feels as though you're going to be torn out of your body, or that your soul is going to be is going to vibrate outside of your body. And I assumed that had something to do with projection, right? That if you can withstand that vibration, or if you can roll out of the body, then you can project yourself. And but these incidences were involuntary, and they became worse and worse. And there were times where I could feel it before I would go to bed. It's almost like a portal opening. You can feel, it's almost impossible to describe, but you just feel this kind of opening where something is off. And if you go to sleep at that point, then you're going to have this encounter, right? Something is going to come through, and that vibration is going to begin, and eventually, you'll wake up in your room, and there will be a creature there, like an alien, or whatever whatever you want to call it, a demon, something there with you. And that is the most terrifying experience, I think, that you can possibly have. And I had this happen, over and over again, to the point that there were times where I was having it like 3 or 4 times a night. And I remember one time I was lying on the couch, and I don't know how old I was, fairly old. I think I was in my 20s at the time. And my parents were in the kitchen. I was watching my mother make uh, some dinner or something in the kitchen. And these invisible, they kind of look like the Predator. If you ever saw the movie The Predator, these things were gliding, were gliding through the living room, through the wall. And I knew, okay, if I can just not move and not let them know that I see them, right? And as soon as as I thought that, their heads just kind of pivoted towards me all at once, and I was sucked out of my body towards them, and I woke up just shrieking, screaming, and my dad comes out. He's like, you're too old for this shit. This should not be happening. And again, those types of things got worse and worse. It would be also worse sometimes when I was sleeping in different areas. So I thought that had something to do with it. Didn't seem necessarily to have to do with the drug intake all the time, because I would have them regardless. And I also had one particularly terrifying one that involved like a reptilian type of entity or creature. And I started wondering, why is it that I'm having these dreams with these very stereotypical kind of archetypal creatures? Could it be, I mean, is it just because I'm consuming so much media, or I'm thinking so much about it? I mean, that could be.
Or
But
the collective unconscious or whatever.
yeah, well, that's what I started thinking, because I started having these things before I got into this type of thing. And so my theory was like, maybe I'm experiencing some sort of, if we're talking about the collective unconscious, some sort of atavistic part of myself, which is represented by these things. And so I came to the idea maybe the gray, because the gray is like this fetal creature, which is humanoid in nature, and maybe this represents the mammalian state or an earlier state of my own development as a fetus, right? As crazy as that sounds, but there's some great books by a guy named Cutchin. Let me see. I think here actually I have one right here. He's in like a brief history of supernatural child abductions. It's got a child sitting in this creature, right?
Yeah.
And his idea is that the grays are related to the old well, they're in multiple cultures,
Like
but
elves or kobolds.
particularly they're elves, but they're also related to changelings and stocks and fetches, right? Which are this idea of dead children, basically the replacement of a child with a corpse, or a dead child, or an abortion, or in the case of Japanese lore, he talks about the kappa, right? The kappa is this water spirit with its head caved in. So apparently, in certain times of famine, these children would be killed, their heads would be caved in, and they would be thrown into the water. And so these water spirits of dead children or aborted children were haunting this area and would haunt people. And so I was thinking, well, maybe in some way I'm experiencing this atavistic return to this earlier state, or it's like the limbic system, right? We dwell so much in our, this rational mind all the time. Maybe there's a lower part of my brain which is needing to be acknowledged. And then you have the reptile, right? The idea of the reptilian creature, particularly in conspiracy theory nowadays, is so popular. And I associate conspiracy theory a lot with shamanism. Actually, I think that the conspiratorial mode of thinking is very intimately or closely related in some ways to developing this kind of consciousness.
Yeah, the book, The Trickster and the Paranormal, points out that a certain amount of paranoia is a common trait in psychics and just liminal people who are more likely to experience, paranormal phenomena. That,
Yeah, and you know what's so interesting about that also is that schizophrenics have been known to use religion as a device for reintegrating the persona after a psychotic break. So there is a link there, right? To using these systems, these cosmologies, right? Because I would call conspiracy theory at its highest level cosmology. It provides a worldview and an explanation for everything, which is, if you do it right, it's holistic and coherent in the same way that a religion would be. Not to say that there aren't conspiracies and that I don't believe that there are many legitimate things going on out there that are conspiratorial in nature, but I'm just talking about conspiracy as a cosmology. But anyway, so you get also the reptiles, right? You see this in conspiracy theory along with the grays, and I think that's featured prominently because it is a kind of an emergent myth which is coming out of the unconscious collectively. And the reptile behaves in a certain way. The reptilian alien behaves in a certain way, which is very much like a human psychopath, right? And it's supposed to resonate with the hindbrain in the human being. And so maybe one is experiencing one's own most primitive, instincts when this type of thing is happening. But
it's
either
somewhat,
way, sorry, go ahead.
somewhat along those lines is like the reptilian. Just humans have an instinctive fear of like snakes or reptiles in general. Even like Burmese, like when I was in Asia, the dogs there, you could tell when they see a snake or a large reptile just by the sort of hysterical high-pitched barking. You could just tell just by hearing the dogs barking, there's a big snake out there or whatever. And I have read that we do have like a snake recognition center in our brain somewhere. I think it was Carl Sagan, some book by Carl Sagan was talking about that. And so it could be that It's similar to, the devil having bat wings. It's like bats and
Sure. Yeah.
reptiles are kind of creepy animals that we instinctively don't like. And so, the reptilians naturally are more sort of wrathful or bad than the grays, who are often seen as, trying to help us in some way. So, I mean,
Yeah.
it could be something along those lines also.
I experienced the Greys as being very sort of mechanical and indifferent, um, but not predatory, right? Whereas the reptilians I experience as being as sort of having this predatory type of consciousness, which has almost like a contempt for humanity, right? Not that I'm just talking sort of like from a psychological or archetypal kind of experience, right? Very very liberal artsy because that was my original background. Um, but so yeah, I started thinking, maybe this is like somehow a portal to the collective unconscious, or you can call it a portal to hell, whatever you want to call it, or you can call it aliens, you can call it demons. These things may have some sort of not necessarily empirical existence, but they do have an existence of their own, which is independent,
Yeah.
and which we can tap into, perhaps, if we're able to get into a certain type of state. I don't know if it's biological, if it's like a materialistic thing, or if there is some sort of non-rational explanation. I guess then it wouldn't be an explanation, but whether or not you can just reliably get yourself into this thing, I'm not sure. But I think some of these practices definitely leads you to this type of thing if you can't control it. I talked to a psychic about it eventually, um, and well, before I get there, so I started also getting further and further with the projection, right? And I was so terrified by some of this stuff, but I kept going with it. And eventually, one day, I did project myself um, out of my body, right? And I was standing in my room, and I was just like, wow, this is actually real. This is actually possible. I walked through the wall into the outside of my house, and I just looked around for a minute, and I got this incredibly dreaded feeling that I could become separated from my body. And I walked back in and went back in, and it was like I hit my into my body, into my chest, and I woke up, and I was just like, I may have gone too far with this. That was kind of my first thought. Maybe I should back off on this. And those experiences kept happening. This psychic told me, he said, the astral world has been like contaminated or something as of late, and there was these holes or these areas which were permeable now. And he said I had carried back with me something or a couple of things that had latched on to me and were now basically feeding on me after um, getting into these different states. They're able to harvest your energy. Right. And he said he had like sealed something or done something. I don't know which was supposed to help me. And I didn't actually have the dreams for a little while thereafter. But once I got to Florida, I began having a couple of these things again, on and off. And the last one I had was this strange kind of mantid-like creature which tried to latch on to me. And I sort of pretended to be asleep. And I know how insane this sounds, but let's just say this is just me describing my dreams, right? For anyone listening. Um, so this thing is basically trying to actually harvest the energy out of me. And I then, once it latched on and couldn't let go, I reversed the flow and I actually pulled all of it into me, right? And it shrieked and tried to unlatch from me, and then it just basically evaporated into sand. And I woke up, and I haven't had it since. It's been like 4 or 5 years.
Well, so you were stronger than that one.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure. But I was just trying to kind of work through the fear, right? So maybe from a psychological perspective, maybe I integrated a part of myself that was disassociated. But around that time, I also started to become more fascinated with the idea of the left-hand path and things like that. And I got into even the idea of carnism, or of healing oneself through meat, right? Through eating raw meat, which I know a lot of other people were getting into at the time, just because of YouTube and things like that. It became kind of like a fad among certain young people. Um, but I was interested in this idea that taking in the vital essence of a living creature basically would heal you. And
It's
it actually says
interesting.
in
Oh,
Chakram Samhitra, I think it is one of the old Ayurvedic texts. There's a couple Ayurvedic texts which say the highest source of Amrit is is flesh that's been recently killed.
yeah, it's interesting that in the ancient rules of monastic discipline for Theravada Buddhist monks, a monk is only allowed to eat raw meat if he is possessed by a spirit.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, that could have something to do with it. That's very interesting. Yeah, I didn't make that connection.
Yeah.
So
So I
there
suppose
could
I
be
should
something.
kind of let the cat out of the bag at my end a little bit and just we've mentioned George P. Hansen and the Trickster and the Paranormal, and I think he has a really elegant theory for describing paranormal phenomena, including, like UFO phenomena and that sort of thing. And that is that there's a certain structure to this world. You've got laws of nature, so called, and that's apparently not enough for a human being because our minds are so complicated. We can spin off into fantasy worlds just with our mind. So you have to have a certain cultural structure also, just rules and laws and taboos that kind of make the structure of the world like solid and predictable enough that weird paranormal stuff can't get in, but it's never going to be perfect. And there's always going to be, sort of paranormal things that don't follow rules necessarily, or not the rules of this world necessarily, who are getting in through the cracks. And so, uh, what can happen is if you've got a liminal situation, like you've got a very liminal person who's, I mean, some witches will just deliberately violate taboos in order to create a more liminal situation, to create bigger cracks so the paranormal can come into this world more easily. And you strike me as a fairly liminal person, seems like. I'm not as liminal. I'm fairly rational, even though I've got some weird ideas and I had a weird father who was much more psychically talented than I am. Um, Still, I like the idea. It seems to make sense. It works better if you're not a materialist, because then
Yeah,
you've just got the full spectrum of possible worlds that are all here simultaneously, and all it takes is just to let down some of the structure, creating, the rules of this world, and then you've got access to these other worlds that might be right next door.
yeah. I think for me, I'm kind of halfway there, right? Because my rational mind is constantly screaming at me like, "This is crazy. Don't say that. Don't do this." But when I kind of set out along this road many years ago now, I sort of intentionally was confronting things that I felt a sense of loathing or horror about, and in some cases even doing things that I felt or knew were morally wrong. And when you do that kind of thing, it really does have a tendency to mess with your persona, right? Because your sense of who you think you were or are is evaporated. Your sense of self, uh, can eventually shatter. And I think the idea is that, if you can put it back together again, then yeah, you will become stronger for it. But there is something to the idea of breaking these taboos that um, at least is thought to create some kind of occult power, and maybe that is because of the fact that you're breaking through into that liminal state or that a relational state, and then one is able to have these kinds of visions um, and see different things and all that. Now, if we're getting into the UFO thing, I think it's like four or five different things. So I'm not going to get into that. I have my own theories about that, and I think by and large, what you're talking about, the anthropological explanation is what I'll call it. Um, I think that's probably the best explanation, the majority of the cases that are occurring. right? I think that a lot of this stuff can be a collective phenomenon, and a person who is psychically sensitive is kind of like an intermediary between, um, well, assuming they're not schizophrenic, is an intermediary between these two worlds, the world of the creative or the imaginal or whatever you want to call it, the right brain, and the other world, and is able to communicate some of these things, not completely go fully insane, like Jung. I think Jung was the perfect example of somebody who could really be considered a shaman or a visionary or whatever you want to call it. I know academics will say no, it's not technically a shaman, but I think in today's modern age, we have repressed and suppressed the irrational mind to such a radical extent that it comes out in projections into the external world in some very strange and interesting ways. And I think this increasing liminality, these ideas of postmodernism, the extreme fringes of postmodernism, is a way that liminality or a relationality is manifesting itself using the rational mind. So it's come about, ironically, through this extreme compartmentalized focus on one aspect or area of consciousness. And then what Jung calls enantiodromia comes about, right? It comes from the Greek word enantios is an opposite, and dromia is a course or a way or a like stream, right? So this extreme focus and denial of all of this stuff that is inside of us um, results in a projection of it into the outside world where we experience it as evil or as the shadow or whatever. If I were to become extremely focused, for example, on justice and equity and rightness, I might begin eventually to perpetrate very unjust actions on others and to focus on ensuring that everyone fits this exact mold. Or I would think if I were to ignore my soul or to be so split off from my muse, my internal anima, right? I might begin manifesting characteristics externally of a woman, or I might have the desire to begin manifesting those because my soul is crying out to be acknowledged. The creative side of me is crying out to be acknowledged, and so it begins manifesting in the outside world. So the society itself manifests this focus on transgenderism and on liminality, and being uncertain, of what's what. Well, shamans have been doing this type of thing for thousands of years, right? Or, grow long hair and put on a dress, right? Try to fool the spirits as a wizard, try to trick them into thinking you're a woman. And then, once you're in between these states, then you're able to heal, you're able to integrate that, as Jung would call it, the anima, right? Which is
Maybe at
the
least you got the
focus on the
potential.
goddess.
I think
What's
most
that?
of them don't, but still, there at least there's the potential. Yeah, I've considered that also. Just after reading about liminality and its ability to allow paranormal events or supernatural events or whatever you want to call them to occur. I've been thinking it's like the political right or the conservatives or to some degree the nationalists nowadays. They want stability, they want structure, regimentation to some degree, even if they want a certain amount of freedom of speech and so forth. Whereas the cultural left especially, they're insisting on all this liminal kind of going against the grain of just natural course of things,
Yeah,
and I'm just
yeah.
wondering, what I mean, if this is on such a large scale, just such broad scale liminality. I mean, there could be like major weird changes happening that are just
I
not going to just follow the course of what is predictable and structured.
I think there will be, and I think that the issue is that people, particularly on the left, I would argue, they're not looking inside of themselves. They're not dealing with this problem. They're instead projecting it outside into the external world. They're not dealing with these problems of nature. And I would, like Thomas Sowell talks about, the constrained vision versus the unconstrained vision, right? So the left today has this vision of freedom as being a total lack of constraint, on the person, on the individual, right? Not understanding that with freedom, there is also this necessary responsibility to create meaning. Otherwise, meaning and the consensus reality erodes, and we're no longer able to communicate with
Yeah,
each
and then
other.
you just
And then
got
we have havoc.
chaos.
We have havoc. That's right. But these forces of chaos, right? They don't care. They want to manifest through human beings, and just sow chaos upon the world. So we're waiting for these Dionysian, these pent up forces to come through and to wreak havoc, so that we can, I guess, hopefully, if there's anything left afterwards, build something new, right? My shaman teacher used to talk about the chaos beings, right? There are many indigenous cultures that believe you dig down into the earth, particularly in Native American culture, you dig down into the earth looking for jewels and gems and whatnot. You're also opening up Pandora's box because you release the chaos beings out into the world.
Yeah, the
And that's
trickster.
one reason why that's one reason why they didn't do that, right? So through our lust and our greed, we unleash these beings, and through our refusal to acknowledge our soul, we have created a situation where we see evil everywhere in the world, but we're not able to look into ourselves and see our own shadow. We just see it everywhere
Which is
else.
really where it comes from. Yeah, yes, Renee Guénon had a kind of a similar idea. At least it reminds me of that. How in the modern world we're so completely divorced from any kind of quality. We're just dealing with quantity, just numbers and just value and just anything that can be measured in numbers is really what the West has degenerated into or progressed into, depending on how you look at it. And it's created like this invisible shield around us that's blocking off like what would you call it, not just paranormal but like divinity and so forth. This we've got like this shield of materialistic ideology that's just sort of blinding us and in a way blocking us off from the divine or from the miraculous or from the magical. And he says that eventually, and we're probably reaching that point already, that just the sheer unnaturalness of it is going to cause this kind of invisible crystal shield to start cracking, but it's going to start cracking on the underside before it starts cracking above. So it's
Yeah.
like more demonic stuff's going to get in before the higher stuff can get in.
You ever
Might
watch
be where
anything
we're at now.
by Thomas Sheridan? He always talks about this type of stuff. I'm sure some people watching will be familiar with him, but he's does videos mostly on paganism and psychology. He's an Irish guy, but he talks about this idea of psychic weather. And he says at certain points, he's been studying um, people who would be considered, mentally unstable, basically, and how they react collectively at certain points. And he calls it Renfielding, after Renfield from Dracula, right? When Dracula gets closer, Renfield, along with the other people at the lunatic asylum, begin to really become agitated, right? And he says basically, this is a symptom of just what you're talking about. The sensitive people feel it first. It's like a canary in the coal mine, right? So Jung was one of those people, right? Before World War II, he saw visions as he was driving through, I think it was a field in Germany, wheat field, and he saw the sky turn black and the fields fill with blood and all of these things like that. And he says, uh, Odin, the war god, is like surfacing in the collective consciousness, right? And so now it's just time for us to have a war, basically.
Yeah,
Well, I think something similar is coming. I don't know if it's going to be war, but some sort of momentous change is probably around the corner for us.
yeah. Buddhists would just define it in karmic terms. Although, you've been mentioning Jung, and what you were just talking about reminds me of his answer to Job. I think it is where one of his
Yes.
most famous classic essays, where he's talking about how like King Saint John the Divine, whoever was the author of the Book of Revelation, with the the angels pouring out the bowls of wrath and the dragon and the third of the world being killed and all and then another third of the world, and according to Jung, it was that this Saint John the Divine was so unnaturally saintly. You know, he had like the pressure of everyone around him, plus his own like conscience and his own ideology and so forth, just forcing him into this narrow, rigid state of saintliness that it was just unsustainable to some degree, and all this blackness and wrath and chaos and so forth was just coming up through his subconscious mind. And I mean, in that sense, it wasn't so much of a external manifestation. It was just his own his own inner angst or something, just from the artificiality of this rigid state that he was trying to live up to. This ideal he was attempting to live up to was just sort of poisoning the well, just poisoning his own mind. And as a monk, I've been in states like that. I mean, it's kind of Freudian, I think, where, you know, the more restrained you are, that the more neurotic you're going to be, or just the more tension and friction you're going to have with the rest of with you know, everything around you, which you know, in a sense, you know, not being a monk now is sort of a release from that to some degree.
You familiar at all with this phenomenon of semen retention? It's really taken over amongst young people, to some degree at least. It's become like a meme, but a lot of people have been doing it. I was always messing around with this type of thing, but the idea is that you create this pent up state of extreme, basically libido, and then you can sublimate it out onto your work, right? And this is also what Freud did towards the end of his life. Stopped having intercourse with his wife because he was trying to push out more work. There is this idea amongst men, I think also that they've failed in some sense, and that they have to become more, to do more. And it's this constant demand to produce more, and like you said, to have more quantity, to specialize more. Ortega calls it the barbarization of specialism, I think, or something like that. Barbarism, specialization, right, that we have in the society. And so all of this pent up frustration is just taking us more and more into this state where something is bound to happen, and the people are so split off from everything because I think, I hate to be a Luddite. I'm using technology right now, but I blame so much on technology. I think the situation that we're in with the addiction is just terrible. I myself, I mean, I've kicked terrible drugs and narcotics, but the one thing that I cannot kick is this phone, which is just on me all the time. And, the constant need for this pseudo connection, this feeling of connection, right? Because there's this existential loneliness. And so you're going to soothe it by looking at this thing and giving yourself this fake,
Yes.
this idea, this fake idea that you're connected when you're really not. I like this dead internet theory, right? That's basically just nobody's on the internet. Almost all of it is just robotic, and we're all just here alone, just looking into the abyss, into this thing. And there's other people that are like 4 feet away from us, but we're all in these cubicles that we carry around with us all
Yeah.
the time.
Yeah, before we get into that, though, I'd like to go back to the semen retention thing just a little bit.
Sure, sure.
And I think a lot of it, I mean, if it's a sort of a fad in the West now, I assume a lot of it has come from incels who they just have the choice of masturbating or not masturbating. So I
Yeah.
assume a lot of it would come from that. Although I think there may be something to it. I remember reading in a book a long time ago how, especially in like medieval China or Taoist China, when there was a lot of Taoism, permeating the culture, they had this idea of, they have yin and yang, right? And the man was supposed to conserve his yang essence, which meant that he wasn't supposed to ejaculate very much, only with his wife. If he's going to be taking pleasure with a concubine or a prostitute or whatever, and they were encouraged to do this, but you're supposed to take in as much yin essence as you can through the intercourse, but you're supposed to save the yang essence, because then it's draining yang essence whenever you have an orgasm.
Yeah. Though that's the real white tantra, also the idea, I think. And in Taoism, I guess there's various rituals, right? One of them is called the Celestial Maiden, which, as far as I can figure out, is yeah, basically just circulating this energy through you by either evoking a goddess and basically masturbating, but not ejaculating. I think that that's part of it, and using this male libido to circulate through, and as you know, in Hinduism, this is supposed to be like the cure for everything. And at least in Shaivism, I think they talk about, or like Yogananda, for example, and Sivananda. They were big proponents of this. Um, I think it was Sivananda who claimed that his memory was excellent, or no, I guess maybe it was Yogananda. I can't remember. I get the two mixed up, but the claim that his memory was almost photographic because he never ejaculated, right? Or I think, like you said, yeah, there is this idea on the internet that one will increase one's vital magnetism also, and that's going to attract the opposite sex. So there's this feeling of like desperation and guilt about, well, I think, man's relationship to pornography today due to technology. And so the answer to that unconsciously becomes these old religious ideas that we reframe in this modern sort of way and say it's like some kind of self-improvement thing when actually, this has to do with the vital energy inside the male body that goes back to Hinduism and beyond. So again, I tie all that back to this resurgence in the occult and this need and this desire for myth. There's thousands of videos of men talking about how they stopped masturbating for a week and now their life is completely turned around, and because this energy is permeating through them and all this stuff. And I just have to kind of chuckle
Yeah, I
at
think
that.
I think if you try anything, you like dedicate your energies towards anything new, it's going to have some kind of effect like that. I mean, it could be just about in any kind of new diet or just about anything like that. If you think it's going to help you, especially, then there's going to be like a placebo effect or just sort of. I remember reading a long time ago about how it was some like uh, it was some electronics company like RCA or something. Like this was back in like the 60s or 70s, where they were trying to use scientific means to increase productivity. So they had this special group of workers and they're trying this and that. They're trying different kinds of lighting and different kinds of just um, personal interviews, and it turned out that no matter what they tried was working, just because the workers were getting special attention and there was just like this energy added to the system that was kind of making everything fresh and new, that just artificially caused improvements in efficiency. And it may be similar with I'm sure there's something to semen retention. I assume there is some spiritual effect of it that
Yeah,
maybe
I,
can
I
be
would
good
agree with
for
you.
that.
I think maybe there's also just the effect that you're not constantly looking at porn on the computer every 5 seconds,
Well,
so you're not
I'm
not
not so
burning
sure
out all the
about that
dopamine or something.
because I there was one person who was following my earlier blog back in this like 10 years ago, and he was almost obsessing on celibacy and semen retention and so forth. And I mean, it just isn't healthy if you take it to that
No,
point. And
it's
also, I
not.
can say from experience, there are a lot of celibate men out there who are just horny. It's like a starving man is just going to fantasize about food all the time. And so
I compare it to being
man, if
what
just sort of like yearning for sex all the time, even if he's, sort of like repressing it and not acknowledging it, that it's still there. And that
I
can cause more problems than benefits.
I equate it to being in AA, they call it being a dry drunk, right? Which is that you're constantly white knuckling it and you're talking about your clean date and all of this type of thing. But in
Yeah.
reality, the one thing all your energy is going to is staying sober and wanting to get drunk, And so if you can get past that, I think, that's and get some sort of healthy attitude or healthy relationship to it, then that's a lot better. Um, there's this famous story that I've been telling everybody lately. this Gurdjieff parable where a nicotine addict comes to him and says, "Mr. Gurdjieff, I can't stop smoking. What do I do?" And he says, "Well, first, you have to just white knuckle it, basically. Just throw the cigarettes away and say, okay, that's it, I'm done. And then once you do that, you come back to me in a month and let me know how it's going, and then I'll give you further instructions." And so the guy comes back in a month and he says, "Well, it was really horrible. I finally did it. I'm just thinking about cigarettes all the time, but I finally managed to stop." And Gerder says, "Good. Now start smoking again, and this time don't get addicted." And that was his instructions to this guy. Whether it was wise or not, I don't know, but I just really like that story.
Yes, yeah, it'd be very tricky not getting addicted again if you're already more or less addicted, and nicotine is an addictive drug and so forth. So I think we are kind of deviating from the occult at this point, though. So maybe we should try
Oh,
and.
I'm sorry. I
Well,
tend
that's
to
all
I
right.
tend to do that.
Yeah, we both do. But see, you're talking about alienation, and it kind of reminds me of like what Renee Guénon was talking about, how we just have started like just modernity and like scientific rationalism and so forth has just created this wall around us where we are just blinded to things that pre-modern people were not blind to. I mean, it's like it's only up until recent times that people acknowledge that there are invisible forces all around us. And
Yeah,
now we've just sort of artificially blocked them off by just refusing to believe that they exist, although most people do admit to having had at least one paranormal experience in their life. There's always deep down people acknowledge that there is something to it, but it's just that our culture now it's almost like misinformation on YouTube or Twitter up until maybe recently, where it's just some things you're just not allowed to believe in, at least not allowed to acknowledge it, otherwise you'll just be like publicly humiliated,
yeah.
if not
No, I
sent.
know. I'm constantly on guard about it, and like I said, my rational mind's always saying, "Don't say anything about this." But look at what's, one of the top industries in entertainment. It's all these reality shows about ghosts and the supernatural, the paranormal, all these fascinations about it. And this is another thing I was going to say. It's so interesting how very recently the US government has just begun acknowledging these UFOs as like this factual thing, and nobody said anything. Nobody cared about it at all. You have all of these Air Force pilots coming out, you have Senate investigations. I downloaded a report there's apparently by the government where they're talking about, what could these things possibly be? And it's just very odd that that's all coming out now. I think certainly a part of it is got to be like psychological operations,
Yeah,
because I don't understand why it would be happening. Why it would be happening now, and this focus on nuts and bolts craft and all of this type of stuff, which I think totally misleads people and gives people the wrong idea of what's going on. I don't understand how it could be anything else other than propaganda, to distract
yeah,
people.
yeah. That book, The Trickster and the Paranormal, does point out that sometimes the like the Air Force or whoever will just deliberately send out like what do you call them? Oh, like Edward Snowden or somebody. What do you call that?
Agent
Uh,
provocateur,
no, no, there's a special
something like
word
that.
for it. Oh man, I'm just having a mental block. But anyways, somebody who just speaks out, they're not supposed to speak out, but they're exposing this.
Oh, whistleblower.
Yeah, whistleblower. There you go. So they'll send out fake whistleblowers that are just like muddying the water. I mean, they're essentially just sowing confusion. But also in that same book, it points out that, I mean, none of this stuff is ever going to be proven empirically simply because it's just slipping through the cracks between the rules. It doesn't follow the acknowledged rules. And so you're never going to be able to come up with like a scientific theory to account for, to be able to predict things and that sort of thing, other than maybe very vaguely.
Are you familiar with Terrence McKenna at all?
I've heard of him. I think I've probably at least read some quotes.
He was an ethnobotanist who was big into the promotion of mushrooms and things like that, psilocybin mushrooms. But he had this interesting theory that was partially responsible for the 2012 craze. You were still a monk then, obviously, but there was a pop craze about the year 2012
Yeah.
because of the Mayan calendar, and McKenna was partly responsible for kind of promoting this idea with this theory that he called the time wave. And his idea was there's this invisible quality called novelty, right? And he says that this novelty ebbs and flows and waxes and wanes in a fractal pattern, which can be overlaid with history, right? Of course, this is the problem because there's no way to measure this at all. But he was able to reverse engineer a bunch of equations that he found in the I Ching into this fractal pattern and then placed it over this graph of history. The other problem with that is where do you begin and end the graph, right? That's always the problem with time series in math and in the stock market or in any kind of linear graph. But he managed to get a placement that he liked for it. But his idea was basically that the universe is undergoing these ebbs and flows where it crystallizes and complexifies more at these various levels. And he said, well, around 2012, the thing goes asymptotic, right? So the novelty just goes off the graph. And he's like, basically at that point, reality will begin to get weirder and weirder and weirder. And people will feel like they no longer have any idea what's going on at this point. Their life will become so strange and surreal that eventually the whole thing will begin receding and de-threading in front of people, and we will meet the alien, and then they will send the White House will send a helicopter for me, and then I'll explain to them, yes, we're just approaching the quintessence, the transcendental object at the end of time, which is pulling us into infinite novelty, and now we're all going to sort of just evaporate away. And I thought that was a really funny and good, it's kind of an apt metaphor for what's been happening.
Yeah, except it didn't exactly happen.
Didn't happen. Maybe his prediction was just too early.
Yeah, well, it's like I was I was taking the 2012 thing, sort of cautiously seriously. It's like, well, maybe there's something to this. That's one of the reasons why I came back to America from Burma the first time and tried to live in America long term. I wanted to be where the action was. If it
Sure.
really did, the spiritual shit really did hit the spiritual fan, I wanted to be where the action was and maybe, play my part if necessary or whatever. And of course, it didn't happen. And then some skeptical friend of mine sent me I think it was a Wikipedia article of all the predictions of the world coming to an end in history, and it's a very long list. It's like
Yep.
they've been predicting it for a long time. And the Christians have been predicting the world was, Jesus was coming and all that for a long time. And of course, when I was growing up, it was, nuclear Armageddon was just inevitable. The World War III with the Soviets, it was going to happen. They didn't know when, but it was inevitable, and that didn't happen. And now it's climate change and so forth is going to be the
Yeah.
end of the world. At least that's the mainstream, the approved version nowadays.
There's a psychology to this idea of imminence, right? And it's called millennialism, I think, in the study of new emerging religious movements, which is the politically correct term for cults now, because you can't say cults because that could be offensive to cult members.
Yeah, we
So
don't
we
offend.
refer to them as NERMs or NRMs, something like that. But yeah, this idea of millennialism always crops up over and over and over again. And yeah, I agree. I think this is just is one of many scares, but there is a psychology of a desire to be on the edge of history, right? To be the last ones here. And I think you see that also in a lot of like fundamentalist Christians, this idea. I think Nietzsche would call it like basically the attitude of the underman, which is just a resentment towards life and a desire for the ultimate transcendental object, which is completely outside of the world, which we just look at as shit, and
Yeah,
we
I,
hope
I
that the whole
think
thing gets
like
blown up.
yeah. I think one of the earliest forms of that that's well known is just the whole Jewish millennial thing, where um, they're they were promised by God Almighty that, you know, Israel, after the Babylonian captivity and all that, that Israel would never again be invaded by a foreign invading army and so forth, and everything was just going to be golden age. You know, there'd be a descendant of David on the throne and all this, and then along came the Romans, and just put an end to that. You know, and so it was just through bitterness and resentment that they really started saying, you know, the world's just kind of going to come to an end, and you know, that's where Christianity arose during that time of just bleak pessimism. And it's like, if we can't be number one in the world, then the whole thing's just gonna end. You know, it's just.
Yeah. I think you've talked about this on your podcast before me, but this guy Festinger wrote this thing, When Prophecy Fails, right? And so the question is, what happens to these doomsday cults when their prophecies fail? And the answer is, well, they just redouble their efforts of proselytization. And this spreading this idea, you know, creates this solidity. And then they'll say, well, actually, the prophecy did happen. It just happened in some other, you know, some other kind of sense. But
Yeah.
it's difficult to dissuade people from the idea that the end is nigh, and you know, it just kind of keeps cropping up over and over again. So, but I, you know, I definitely do think something is going to happen. I don't think it's going to be doomsday, but I'm definitely getting that imminence feeling going on, right?
Yeah, I mean,
And
sooner or later, it's bound to happen.
yeah, yeah, I think, you know, empires only last so long, and if I were to look at a really down to earth materialistic way of talking about or convincing somebody, I would say, well, our monetary and fiscal policy has been very poor for a few decades now, and
Yeah.
we're going to have to pay the piper here in America. Raising interest rates is just a temporary solution. Everything we do is just a temporary solution at this point, and the debt will never be paid down.
Yeah, yeah. I remember reading in Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, he pointed out that it was a truism back in the 1700s when he wrote this, that a surefire sign of the decline of a civilization is when eunuchs attain social prominence.
Yes, yeah. And at the same time, you know, a lot of what was causing that social zeitgeist, if you want a materialistic explanation, was inflation, right? They began debasing the currency of the denarii so much where they would take little slivers off and then melt the slivers down to fund these new projects in the army. And the government would, of course, get out there and spend the money. And then all of the people that were holding denarii would basically be losing money because they're depreciating, they're devaluing the currency. And
Yeah,
then at a certain point, the inflation gets so high, well, they didn't have companies. I don't know what you would call them back then, but people were not able to, businesses, I guess, were not able to buy the supplies that they needed. Farms began to go under, and famine began to spread. And by the time the barbarians got there, you know, there were people welcoming them in. And I think we got definitely, you know, pretty similar situation right now.
yeah, it's fairly similar, I think. I do think that getting into almost a cult, at least from a Buddhist point of view, that just American civilization is to some degree a reincarnation of Rome.
Mhm.
So I think Edgar Casey, who was I assume you know who he was. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
he was back in the 50s. He was saying over and over again, you know, you were a Roman, and you know, just being a Roman in a previous life seems to have been fairly common. You know, at least in Edgar Casey's, you know, trance prophecies and so forth. And it does make sense. I mean, there's history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but there are definitely similarities.
You know what the secret destiny of America is, according to many of the Scottish Rite Freemasons and people like Manly P. Hall. You know, America was meant to be a reincarnation of Atlantis, right?
Oh,
So
really?
not only I mean, a reincarnation of Rome, certainly, but also I think of Atlantis. Yeah, America. The whole point of America was to be the new Atlantis. But we all know what happened to Atlantis in the end, right?
Well, in my opinion, what happened to Atlantis was it was Crete, and the volcanic eruption of Thera wiped out their navy and their agriculture, and pretty much caused the civilization to go into severe decline, so that the Greek-speaking barbarians from the mainland could finally conquer them. But
That makes sense. You mean it wasn't a giant volcano?
well, I mean, it was a volcano. It was a volcanic island on like 70 miles from Crete. which would have caused seismic problems and like tsunamis and so forth that would have wiped out the Cretan navy, which according to the Thucydides was the first standing navy in existence, which it may have actually been. They were sort of like the guardians of the Eastern Mediterranean. They were policing the shipping lanes and so forth. And when I mean, I've also read that I mean, this, we're kind of getting away from the occult again, but there like was fairly common in ancient times is you've got a governmental and economic system that works for a city and a city state, but once it turns into an empire, it just doesn't work anymore because it's just not designed for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, let's try and get back to the occult. And
Yeah. Sorry,
no, that's all
I
right.
always digress. I
Okay,
go from one
yes.
thing to the next to find all these threads. That's
Yeah,
part of, I guess that's part of the occult, actually.
yeah.
Um,
So, like
I was,
I was saying, my father, he did a lot of past life regressions and did a lot of seances. I remember you're talking about scary phenomena when you were a kid. Is when I was a kid, my dad had this old reel-to-reel tape recorder, and they recorded a seance, and I listened to that. That was kind of my brother and I would, he's just kind of sort of like the equivalent of watching a scary movie, except your
yeah,
parents are involved, you know.
yeah. Well, it was great entertainment. I know for the post World War One generation, also, that's when it became really big, really famous. Theosophy took over, stuff with Christian Science as well.
Yeah, yeah, I
All of
got a
those
theory
became
for
very
that too.
famous.
It was like in the sort of the mid to late 1800s. Like that was when the spiritualism arose in America and Christian Science, the faith healing, and all this kind of a thing. And I think it may have been sort of a spiritual reaction to like Darwinism, because
Yeah,
Darwinism, I mean, he really just put the final nail in the coffin for like creationism, at least for most objective, rational non-Christians, even a lot of Christians. And so it was, he had pretty much, explained away that the entire world, including us, could be here by completely natural means. And there was sort of a spiritual backlash today. I think there was this resurgence of like psychic phenomena and like the psychic investigation societies and spiritualism and seances and rapping on walls and all rapping tables levitating and all this kind of a thing.
yeah.
It rose right around that time also.
As far as I can see, it's the spiritual version of Romanticism, right? Right around or just after the Romantic era. When the Romantic era, as I see it, is a reaction to, like you said, stuff like, Darwinism, even though that came later, but, Marxism, dialectical, Hegelian, materialism, whatever, all of this type of stuff, the
Yeah.
Industrial Revolution, and of course, these big wars that come later. I think the spiritual romanticism is in some way a desire to have some escapism and to go back to an era that was pre-modern, but that couldn't be reclaimed, and it was only sort of recreated by this romantic period, of theosophy. It's a lot of it is just very Victorian, Jiddu Krishnamurti, all this stuff, which I find completely unlistenable, but is fascinating in its own right.
Yeah, Christian, I can appreciate Krishnamurti as
I
I
can
get
listen to him. He's
older.
just so boring.
Yeah, as I've gotten older, I've had more appreciation for the idea, for example, that if you've got ideals, I mean, inevitably you're never going to fully be able to live up to them. So it just creates hypocrisy and living a dishonest life if you have ideals that you try to live up to, and that you should just sort of be who you are as mindfully and clear-mindedly as you can. And then I
I just
remember,
want my gurus to be exciting. I want my gurus to be exciting and to have sex scandals and all this sort of thing.
yeah, Krishnamurti had those. It was just
I guess you're right. I guess he
they
did
weren't
actually.
high profile. But I agree with that. I like rascal sages. That they just I don't know. There's just a desire for freedom, like a saint, like an Orthodox Theravada Buddhist saint. I mean, there's so much he can't do. It's like he's not even free anymore. He just, out of necessity, has to do the right thing every time. So there's like no freedom left, you know, and essentially, you know, he's like a slave to, Dharma. And I mean, that's not a bad thing. I mean, essentially you've merged with, Dharma, you're no longer an individual. But it's sort of like Dostoevsky in the Notes from Underground, where he's got the guy who he deep down he wants freedom, and so he just perversely does what he knows is self-destructive and wrong, just as a way of defying this this rightness that wants to enslave him. And when you can kind of merge that with a sage like Neem Karoli Baba is probably my favorite, super sage of the last 100 years. And he was doing all kinds of stuff. I mean, he didn't follow any rules. He'd tell lies and he, he'd fondle women. Although, I mean, it was like there's this one story of this American hippie chick who goes to join the ashram, and he's got her massaging his legs. He's sitting there and she's like rubbing his feet, and he keeps moving her hands up higher and higher. And then she starts thinking like something, and he'll just yell at her, "No," like "Nahin" in Hindi, because he's reading her mind the whole time. She starts thinking, something kind of off color or something. He'll just break off his conversation with the audience, who's like, some of them are like gasping at how far up her hands are going, because he's like leading them up there. And then he's just like reading her mind the whole time. She starts having the weird neurotic kind of thoughts. He just immediately no, and then just goes back to talking. So it's that kind of like rascality turned into like spirituality somehow. That, I mean, it appeals to me. I couldn't manage it myself. I'm not sure I would if I could, but still, this just that kind of thing. Like as a Buddhist, I have no choice but to believe in occultism, simply because it's just throughout the scriptures. The sages, through meditation practice and so forth, they develop psychic powers that are not considered to be supernatural, because in Buddhism everything is natural. Anything that occurs, it's in accordance with cosmic laws, just that you've reached like a higher level where you can do things that you couldn't do before. So as I can accept psychic abilities that are paranormal or whatever fairly easily, partly because of my father, and also partly just because I've adopted a spiritual system that just accepts it as a matter of course. Although trying to explain exactly how it happens is something altogether different.
Yeah. Well, I agree with this idea that there aren't necessarily any miracles, right? That they're all just matter of course for whatever. If it happens, it has to be from nature. So, and if you believe in, I guess, dependent origination, then all of those miracles, everything is related in this big web of karma, web of causation. And in that case, can there really be such a thing as a miracle? I think that was like similar to something David Hume said, something like that. But
Yeah.
go ahead.
No, I was just thinking David Hume. I've read some David Hume, and it's like he had this idea. I mean, he was just completely against miracles, partly because he was completely against Christianity. He was a member of the so-called Enlightenment that wanted to, eradicate superstition, which meant mainly Christianity, and replace it with philosophy, which eventually just turned into scientism. So it wasn't necessarily an improvement. But
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think part of the idea of myth is this idea that maybe a miracle could be possible. When you remove that, you kind of take away so much of the basis for what was good about pre-modern society also, right? I mean, the idea of the miracle gives birth to this kind of divine mandate idea, right? It's some sort of underlying pretext that gives you, well, an excuse, I guess, to have this coherent society, to have laws. If you have a priest or you have a prophet, let's say the prophet is like, um, is this sort of underlying foundation upon which all of the laws are built, or a shaman or someone who's able to divine those different axioms or pretexts for creating a society. When you take that away through this extreme emphasis on rationality, what do you have left? Well, you just dissect everything until there isn't anything left. And then what you're left with is kind of like what I was saying, this web of causation, which is it's not linear, but everything just kind of leads into everything else, right? And one of the whole ideas about Christianity, I feel like, was it creates this linear history, right? There's a point A at which things begin, and then there's a point X at which things will dissolve, right? History begins when God steps into the flesh of man, or when he waves his hand and
Let
everything
there be
comes about.
light.
Yeah, and there's
Yeah,
this strict
lux.
order. There's a strict order to everything, right? Same thing in Islam. Um, but at the same time, I mean, the pre-modern, pre-Christian people were able to build some sort of civilization, I guess, without necessarily needing to have that focus on a linear history. I like this idea of, cyclical history that's in paganism. And I think the ideas of shamanism or the experience of shamans kind of bear out that idea. And it squares with me a lot better with like Platonism and those types of ideas, that there is something outside of history which we are sort of instantiating. And there's another thing I was going to say. This idea in paganism and in indigenous societies is talked about by Mircea Eliade. It's called in illo tempore or illud tempus, which is this idea that the mythical time is formal, is outside of our reality in a similar way to a Platonic formal world. The first times, the primordial times, are still existing now, will always exist. And so when you do an occult ritual, a real occult ritual, you are in some way opening up a portal to the first times and allowing them to occur, through that ritual. And so the ritual, real occult ritual is not a recreation. It's an actual instantiation of that original event in that original time in illo tempore. And so when you do a ritual of sympathetic magic, which is what was one type of magic that's often used today and was used thousands of years ago, right? You are not just simulating that event or that thing that you want to happen. The ritual is itself the thing, is itself an instantiation of that which it symbolizes. This is
Yeah,
almost impossible for the Western mind to wrap your head around. And it took me years of thinking about it before I kind of like started to even get to what it
yeah.
was after I
The
did some
Hindus went
shamanism.
through a long phase of that with the fire sacrifice, where the fire sacrifice just became more important than the gods they were propitiating, where it was just sort of kept it. I mean, the fire sacrifice in a way got to the point where it was just keeping the universe going, just the ritual
Yeah,
itself.
and that's right. And I think you can follow the degeneration of a society in that. I mean, look at the Aztec civilization. Their rituals got their sacrifices. Originally, you should only need one human sacrifice if you're going to do that sort of thing, right? Because the living God is instantiated in this person, and their sacrifice renews the world and all that. But then the Aztecs began, I guess, maybe taking it a bit too literally, and they were sacrificing person after person to the point I was reading it's at one point it was like 3% of their entire population of their empire per year. And that was, immediately preceding the arrival of Cortez and that whole affair, which led to
Yeah.
their
Yeah,
downfall.
definitely from a Buddhist point of view, they were making some really gnarly karma and some
Yeah,
karmapins on that. Like I
yeah,
was reading that every month they would flay somebody alive, and then a virgin girl would have to wear the skin of the other person that was flayed as a way of bringing about the new moon. Like
yeah.
once the
And
moon.
they were doing that stuff to people all the time.
Yeah.
If it is to be believed, some of those conquistador texts, which I'm sure a lot of them are exaggerated or some of them are propaganda, but apparently the anthropological record, especially what they're finding right now, really bears out a lot of that. That they were doing just the most atrocious acts. There's record by a guy named Bernal de Castillo, I think, who's a very famous conquistador chronicler. And he talks about a retreat that the conquistadors had from the city where they were looking up on the pyramid and they saw some of their captured uh, brothers or soldier friends, compatriots, had been skinned alive, and the soldiers, the Aztec soldiers, were wearing the skins, dancing, and they were eating the flesh of the soldiers in a kind of a chili mole, is what he said, some sort of nut mash nut sauce with human flesh. They would do this sort of thing all the time, apparently. What really interests me is the mythic ideas of, for example, there's this thing called the Festival of Tuxcatl, which is when an individual is chosen to be basically like God for a year. A lot of indigenous societies, apparently, I think in Europe, also had this type of thing where an individual basically was chosen as a sacrifice, but he was not out of spite. He was supposed to actually be one of the best
Yeah,
of the
Fraser's
tribe.
Golden Bough says a lot about that kind of thing.
Yeah, this idea of the king and the ultimate sacrifice that the king makes, but he's like a god man and that he can break all the taboos. There should at least be one person we have in the society, right, that can get everything concentrated towards him like this electrical force, and he can break through all of these taboos anytime he wants. So this person has 1 year to basically he marches through the city in this constant procession where he's just draped in jewels, and he can take anything he wants. He can walk into any building he wants. He can have any woman that he wants. And then at the end, he has his heart ripped from his chest while he's alive on top of this pyramid.
Yeah,
And
it's like the early Romans. I mean, used to be fairly universal that the king was the personification of the nation, and he had to be strong. So when the king started showing signs of feebleness, like white hairs and that kind of a thing, he'd be ritually sacrificed. The Druids, they didn't rip his heart out, but they'd kill him and like prophesy based on the blood and the organs and so forth.
yeah,
And even as late as I think it was around 300, the year 300, like approximately, I think it was during the reign of Diocletian, maybe a little earlier than that, in the Roman Empire, in the provinces, not in Rome itself, but the Saturnalia was celebrated by having a soldier chosen by lot at the beginning of the Saturnalia. He could do anything he wanted, just like you were saying. He could go into a shop, take anything. He could have any woman, any boy, whatever. And then at the end of the Saturnalia, he had to go to the nearest temple of Saturn and cut his own throat.
wow, that's incredible. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and according to Fraser in the Golden Bough, that was sort of you're replacing the king. I mean, you don't really want to kill the king once you get to a certain level of civilization or whatever. The king, they just make a symbolic king, like the king of misrule at the Saturnalia.
Yeah,
And he's the one who takes the hit. He can
it's
do
just
whatever he
him.
pleases. He's like the king, but then he's the one that takes the hit. And then, the actual king just has, like, he vicariously is sacrificed. He's got a representative who takes the hit for him.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that dates back to a lot of these indigenous tribes where they surely did sacrifice their king, and I think the king would have been the best among them, and they would probably, potentially ritually ingest maybe pieces of him. And he's like, he's the golden boy, right? Like Christ. This is like the Eucharist. You know, we kill the king, and then we all take in little pieces of sunshine from him. It's very Freudian.
Yeah.
Also.
Well, I have to admit, I'm kind of glad that we're not doing that anymore. So, in a
Freud's.
sense, it's like the modern world has accomplished what the ancients were trying to do. It's like the ancients or the pre-modern people, they knew that. I mean, they had like this inkling of what George P. Hansen was talking about, how structure keeps the scary occult at bay. If you've got like a structure, it keeps everything, predictable and relatively safe, at least predictable. And, so they'd have all these taboos, you're not supposed to eat beans, not supposed to touch horses, just all these weird taboos that were largely arbitrary, but it did create a structure that did serve a purpose. And then in modern times, we've just come up with this huge edifice of this scientism, scientific realism that probably succeeds as well as anything else to keep the occult
Yeah,
at
keep the
bay.
darkness at bay.
Yeah, but eventually it's going to break down, and it's just all going to come rushing in like a wave.
Yeah, yeah, I think we're definitely towards the end of that cycle. And I believe a lot in what Plato says, right, in the Republic, in like chapter 8, there's a cycle. And we're nearing the end of that cycle where this idea of freedom takes over, but it leads ultimately to tyranny, right? So we accomplished all of these things that were originally envisioned, but ironically, they lead to our downfall, and then the cycle starts all over again. And that's samsara for you, right?
Yeah, yeah, you can't really fix samsara. It's just always going to be messed up.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it is sort of an occult phenomenon or just paranormal, even that we're even just existing at all, seems to me.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I guess we've been at this for
About
getting
two
fairly
hours.
close to 2 hours. So if there's anything you
Yeah.
particularly mention before we wrap this up, is
Oh
your chance.
gosh. I don't know. You're putting me on the spot. That's a tough one. But I'll think about it. I'll figure
Yeah.
something out.
Well, I can tell you one of my father's stories I mean, I can tell you a number of my father's stories that, I'd be
Sure.
sitting on his lap as a kid. There was one time he was astral traveling and he met a galley slave. And I mean, he was a dead galley slave, it was the spirit of a person who had been a galley slave. And they were naked on this ship. My father was able to see what was going on, as just through whatever means. It could be
Mhm.
just imagination in a trance state or something. I don't know. But these galley slaves were naked. All they got was like their food bowl was just their cup hands. If you had big hands, you got more food than if you had small hands. And it was such a horrible existence that when they were going to engage with another ship, it was some sort of fighting ship that they had the plan of just not pulling in the oars because when you pull up alongside the other ship, you have to pull in the oars or the oars break. So they just had
Okay.
this desperate plan of we're just not going to pull in the oars, and then maybe the other guys will treat us better than than our own masters. And it turned out everyone chickened out except him, and the oar split, and just the sharp edge of the oar just went through his torso, and that's how he died. And my
Wow.
father could see this kind of a thing. Also, he claimed to remember a number of his own past lives. So I was exposed to the idea of rebirth or reincarnation from a young age. And it wasn't his life before his life as my father, but it was like the one before that, where he was some Scottish fellow and he was on some like surveying party for the British government in like northern India, kind of the foothills of the Himalayas. And they're riding their horses by the trail down this trail, and he sees this little brass pot sitting there. And he wanted to pick it up as a souvenir. And one of the guides says, "Don't touch that. A shaman is using that to collect rainwater for some ritual. Don't touch it." But he just, being a Westerner, an arrogant Westerner, he just picked it up anyway. And, he remembered how it looked. It was just a plain brass pot with just like two lines. I think they were like like zigzag lines inscribed around the rim of it. And they continued on their way. And then that afternoon, they're setting up camp, and he's taking his horse's saddle and putting it onto putting it on something else, setting it down off the horse. And as he's leaning over, an arrow comes out of the bushes and hits him under the shoulder blade and comes out of his neck here. And that always would just snap him out of the hypnotic trance that he was in. He'd be coughing, and that would be the end of the past life regression.
Well, it sounds like your father was a much more talented warlock than I am. And those sound like pretty legit past lives, because most people's past lives, particularly because, UG Krishnamurti was fond of pointing out in a theosophical society, everybody was Queen Victoria or everybody was Napoleon or
Yeah.
whatever. So I'm much more apt to believe those kind of humble, stories about people's past lives where they die in a fairly mundane way. It seems much
Yeah.
more likely.
There was more to it that he remembered. I remember he remembers one of the earliest memories, and for some reason in past life regressions, it's the most like emotionally intense experiences are the ones that you remember the most easily.
Yeah,
So it
it
just be
makes
the
sense,
most
right? They
karmic,
generate the most karma, I guess.
yeah, the most karmic experiences. There was one where he's lying on a cot in like a cottage. This is like in Scotland somewhere, the Highlands of Scotland, and he's just raging because he's got smallpox and everyone just abandoned him. Everyone's afraid to even take care of him because they don't want to get smallpox too. Smallpox is really gnarly. So he had pockmarked face for the rest of his life, and he believes that he killed his own sweetheart, that he's crying over a grave. He remembers that's sort of like this fragment that he would remember. And he believed that it was his own sweetheart who abandoned him, because of the smallpox and the pockmarks or whatever. And then there's one scene where he's on a ship and they've got these large blocks of stone, like marble or something, that they're transporting, but they're also using it as ballast. And they get into this storm where one of the blocks in the hold has broken loose and it's sliding back and forth in the hold. And they've got to get this thing lashed down again before it beats a hole through the wooden hull of the ship. And one of the guys gets pinned up against the side of the ship by this block of stone, and somebody's yelling, "Bring aft a light, bring aft a light." And that's just where the memory ends. That fragment ends in his past life regression. And for all I know, it could be just vivid imagination, like dream images or whatever, but he took it very seriously. And
Yeah. A
he's
lot of
got
this stuff
lots of stories,
uses
that sort of thing.
a lot of this stuff uses, I think it was Jung who calls it active imagination, right? But at a certain point, I don't know. I mean, this sounds like a very, very vivid and believable, detailed sort of
Yeah, well, in a
recollection.
way, karma itself is like active imagination. Karma is a mental state and it
It's
literally
volition.
means action. So in a way, it's like we're creating our own world. We're sort of our karma, our mental states, our volition, or what Schopenhauer would call will, is just kind of pushing us forward through this unknown, and we're sort of creating the details of it.
Yeah. Well, maybe I should have some volition to remember my past lives, and God willing, I will, and I will report them and let you know.
Yeah, I don't remember any of mine either. Although my father was convinced that I was his father, which makes me my own grandpa.
Yeah, it's
And before
remarkable.
we end this, somebody has made an urgent request of me, so I'll be back in a second. I got to show something.
Sure, absolutely.
All right. Here we go. Let's get you two. All right, here we go. So I've been sitting down here in the basement with 15 puppies, and here's two of them.
And
New
what are they?
this
Those
world.
aren't whippets. What are they?
No, these are bullshits. They're part
Ah,
bull terrier, like
yeah,
Boston
Shih Tzu
Bulldog,
and Bull
and
Terrier.
part Shih Tzu.
That's
They're little Dockworth,
interesting.
that's what they are. Yeah, look
I've
at
never seen those before.
that. Yeah. All right, let's get back inside.
I did used to have two Russian wolfhounds, though.
Russian wolfhounds.
Two Russian wolfhounds.
Okay, come on. I gotta go in here for now. Just a second. All right. Okay, I had to do that. That was by strenuous request. So.
They're
And
cute.
there's nothing occult about those puppies, I suppose, other than they might be in a liminal state just because they haven't got a structured character yet. They're so little or something, but
Well, maybe there's somebody's reincarnation.
yeah, well, from the Buddhist point of view, they certainly are. Yeah, they've been in the hell realms and heaven realms and everywhere in between. And then they just wound up in our basement.
Well, thank you for this conversation, Pena Basa. I really appreciate it.
Yeah,
And
we should do another one.
sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. It's a great honor. I've watched all your videos.
Really?
So absolutely, every single one of them. I've been watching them since you first got on here.
Really?
Yep.
Yeah. Have you on Brian Rue's BitChute channel? He's got more than I've got put up.
Yes, I have tuned into his BitChute channel as well. Although it's the format of BitChute makes it difficult to scroll through all of the past ones because
Yeah,
it's like
he's got this playlist called Buddhist Monk Truthers that's got probably 200 videos that we've done.
I that was where I started watching him originally. Actually, I think I found you through Brian's channel
Yeah,
initially,
a
I
few people.
believe.
But by the same token, a lot of people say, "Oh, you shouldn't have anything to do with that guy."
Yes. Yeah, I can. Well, I understand that. I can understand why people would say that, but he seems like a good guy. I like him. And his preparing for alien contact videos are always amusing as well to me. He has some interesting characters on there.
Yeah, yeah. He invited Ajahn Punadamo to be on his recent alien encounters group, so that's could be interesting. They
Oh,
did
great.
that
Yeah.
this evening.
Yeah, that's great. I love Ajahn Punadamo. I've watched all his videos with Ajahn Sona also on Buddhist cosmology. They're very interesting. Sometimes I'll just put them on and kind of go to sleep and imagine that I'm, you know, in a ghost world or that I'm a Naga or something like that, which is why I asked the question about the Naga. It sounds like a very sort of interesting place to be.
Oh yeah. Yeah, yeah. So we should do this again sometime. Maybe we can do a more
Yeah,
basic
absolutely.
one, like on the nature of dukkha or something next time.
Sure, anytime.
All
Yeah,
right.
yeah. I feel like I've gotten pretty well acquainted with the three marks of existence after being a dope fiend for a while.
Yeah, I was never actually a full-fledged fiend, but I was definitely an enthusiast for a while.
Mhm. Now I'm talking about opiates.
Yeah. Yeah,
That's
so
the real,
we can get into that next time.
that's
So
the real deal. Yeah,
for all of you out there, be sure to like and subscribe. And you've got your own YouTube channel, right?
I do. I do.
Yeah, the
I
link
pretty much just
down below.
kind of let it fall to the wayside, honestly. But I enjoy talking to other people more than I enjoy talking to myself. So
Yeah, it's easier too.
yeah, yeah, it's probably more healthy as well.
All right. Yeah. So everyone out there, be happy. And now I push the stop recording.